It started with 3 knocks that came from the front door at exactly 12:17 a.m. Not loud enough to sound urgent, not soft enough to dismiss as the wind, but perfectly measured, as though whoever stood outside wanted you to know they were patient, that they had all the time in the world, and that sooner or later your curiosity would become stronger than your fear. If you have ever lived alone, you already know the strange silence that settles over a house after midnight, when every appliance seems louder than it should be and every shadow appears to have shifted just enough to make you question your memory. Imagine hearing those 3 knocks while every neighbor's porch is dark, while your phone shows no notifications, while the street outside has become so empty that even stray dogs refuse to wander through it. Now imagine the voice that follows. Hello. Not from outside. From the other side of your front door. Then, after several seconds of silence, another voice, almost identical. Who's there? Most people would answer without thinking. That is exactly why so many never get the chance to answer a second time. My grandfather never believed in ghosts, curses, or haunted houses. He spent 40 years repairing electrical lines in remote villages where old people whispered about spirits hiding inside abandoned wells or wandering along empty roads after dark. He laughed at every story because he believed fear was simply another kind of darkness people carried inside themselves. Yet there was one rule he obeyed without exception. Every night before locking his door, he checked the clock, and if it was already past midnight, he refused to answer anyone who knocked, not because he was afraid. Because his father had disappeared after breaking a single sentence. Never say, "Who's there?" after midnight. When I was a child, I treated it as another old superstition. Families always invent strange traditions to scare children into staying indoors. Don't whistle at night. Never count stars. Don't leave mirrors facing your bed. It all sounded ridiculous, and I buried the warning somewhere in the back of my mind where forgotten advice usually dies. Years later, after my grandfather passed away, I inherited his small house at the edge of town. It sat alone beside a narrow forest road where fog gathered every evening as though the trees themselves breathed it into existence. The house was old but sturdy, filled with fading photographs, heavy wooden furniture, and clocks that ticked just a little too loudly whenever the sun disappeared. I moved there because I needed somewhere quiet after my divorce. I told myself isolation would help me think. Instead, it taught me that silence can become louder than any scream. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened. The nights were peaceful except for owls calling from the woods and branches scratching against the roof whenever the wind picked up. Then, one rainy evening, while cleaning the attic, I found a notebook hidden inside an old toolbox. The first page contained only one sentence. If they knock after midnight, never ask who is there. The remaining pages were filled with dates stretching back decades. Beside nearly every date was a single word: ignored. 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 Then, halfway through the notebook, answered. Nothing else followed for 6 blank pages. I laughed, convinced my grandfather had been recording some strange family joke, but something about those empty pages stayed with me. Why leave space after only one word? Why stop writing entirely? The answer arrived 4 nights later. The power failed at exactly 12 o'clock. Not flickering. Not fading. It simply vanished, dropping the entire house into complete darkness while rain hammered against every window. My phone battery had already died earlier that evening, leaving me with only an old flashlight I found in the kitchen drawer. Its beam barely reached the hallway before fading into thick shadows. Then came the knocks. 3. Perfectly even. My heartbeat immediately accelerated, though I couldn't explain why. The notebook flashed through my memory, followed by my grandfather's warning, but logic quickly replaced fear. It was probably a traveler whose car had broken down. Maybe someone needed help. Another 3 knocks. Then silence. I stepped toward the door, stopping only when I noticed something impossible. No footsteps. Whoever had approached my porch should have crossed the soaked wooden steps outside. I should have heard splashing water or creaking boards. Nothing. I leaned closer. That's when a woman's voice drifted through the wood. "Hello." Her voice sounded tired. Cold. Almost trembling. Then, "Who's there?" I frowned. Why would someone outside ask who was inside? Before I could process the question, another voice answered from somewhere farther away. "Who's there?" It sounded exactly like the first. Identical. Then another. And another. The voices multiplied until it seemed dozens of people stood outside repeating the same question back and forth. "Who's there? Who's there? Who's there?" None of them sounded human anymore. They sounded like recordings being copied over themselves until every word became distorted. My mouth instinctively opened. Every instinct told me to answer. To ask the obvious question. "Who's there?" The words reached the back of my throat before my grandfather's notebook returned to my memory. Never ask. I forced myself backward. The voices stopped immediately. Absolute silence. Then one final whisper, so close it felt as though lips rested against the other side of the door. Good. The power returned seconds later. When I opened the door the next morning, the porch was dry despite the night storm. No footprints. No puddles. Nothing except 3 narrow scratches carved vertically into the wood. They looked almost like fingernail marks. I spent the next day convincing myself exhaustion had caused everything. Stress, grief, loneliness, those things can distort reality. Yet when I drove into town for groceries, I casually mentioned the strange experience to the elderly cashier. Her smile disappeared. She quietly asked what time it happened. When I told her, she refused to hand me my change until I answered another question. "Did you ask who was there?" I shook my head. She sighed with visible relief. "My husband did." She wouldn't explain further. She simply crossed herself and whispered that I should never answer voices after midnight because they are never asking for permission to enter the house. They are asking permission to become you. That sentence followed me home. Over the following week, the knocking continued every night, always at different times after midnight, always exactly 3 knocks, always followed by voices repeating the same impossible question. Sometimes the voices belonged to strangers. Sometimes they belonged to people I recognized. My mother, who had died 15 years earlier. My younger brother living hundreds of miles away. Even my own voice. The first time I heard myself speaking outside my own front door, every hair on my arm stood upright. "Who's there?" The imitation was flawless. Exactly my voice. Exactly my breathing. Exactly my hesitation. I backed away from the entrance, refusing to respond. Then my own voice laughed. Not loudly. Softly. Like someone pleased that a game had become more interesting. Days turned into weeks. Sleep became impossible. Dark circles formed beneath my eyes, and I began hearing faint knocks even during daylight hours. Neighbors started avoiding me after I asked whether anyone had visited my house at night. One elderly man quietly admitted that nobody had lived there very long since my grandfather died. They always leave. What happens if they don't? He stared toward my house before answering. They stop leaving. I decided enough was enough. The following night, before midnight, I placed a recording device beside the front door to prove to myself that none of this was real. At 12:19, 3 knocks. The recorder captured them perfectly. Then the voices. Then silence. The next morning I replayed the audio. The knocks were there. The silence was there. But the voices were gone. Instead, after the final knock, another sound emerged. My own breathing. Not from inside the house. From outside. Slow. Patient. Standing directly before the microphone. Listening. My blood turned cold. I checked the recording time. The breathing lasted nearly 43 minutes. I had spent that entire time sitting in my bedroom. So who had been breathing outside my door? That evening I searched through every notebook my grandfather had left behind until I discovered a folded newspaper clipping hidden inside an old Bible. The article described a string of disappearances dating back almost 70 years. Every victim had vanished from locked homes without signs of forced entry. The only common detail investigators could find was that each disappearance occurred shortly after neighbors reported hearing someone repeatedly knocking on doors during the middle of the night. Witnesses claimed the missing residents had been heard asking a single question before falling silent forever. The article dismissed it as folklore. My grandfather had circled one sentence in red ink. They were never found. Beneath it, he had written his own note. Because nothing leaves. It only changes places. The following night, determined to end the nightmare, I nailed every window shut and pushed heavy furniture against the front entrance. I convinced myself that if whatever haunted the house couldn't enter, it would eventually leave. Midnight arrived, nothing happened. 12:15. Still nothing. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax. Then 3 knocks echoed. From upstairs. Not the front door. The attic. Slow. Patient. Directly above my head. Every muscle locked. Another 3 knocks. Then my grandfather's voice drifted through the ceiling. Who's there? I couldn't breathe. He had been dead for years. Then another voice answered. Mine. I'm here. The attic door slowly creaked open on its own. A cold draft rolled down the staircase carrying the unmistakable smell of wet earth and old wood, followed by dozens of overlapping whispers repeating the same question again and again until individual voices disappeared into one endless chorus. Who's there? Who's there? Who's there? I stared upward, unable to move, because something was descending the attic stairs. It wore my grandfather's clothes. It had my grandfather's posture. But its face shifted every few seconds. An old woman. A child. A police officer. My mother. Me. Every face paused just long enough to smile before melting into another. When it reached the bottom step, it stopped only a few feet away. Then it leaned forward and whispered with my own voice. You already answered. I opened my mouth to deny it. Nothing came out. Because somewhere deep inside my memory, hidden beneath weeks of fear and sleepless nights, I suddenly remembered the first night. The woman had said, "Who's there?" I never answered aloud. But inside my head, I had thought the words. "Who's there?" The thing smiled wider. "You invited me." Its body dissolved into complete darkness, flowing across the floor like liquid shadow before disappearing beneath my feet. The lights exploded. Every clock inside the house stopped at exactly 12:17. Then every mirror reflected someone standing behind me. Not one person. Dozens. Each one wearing my face. When I finally found the strength to turn around, the room was empty. The mirrors still weren't. The next morning, I packed everything I owned and abandoned the house forever. I never returned, and within months the property was demolished after mysteriously collapsing during a storm. Workers claimed they heard knocking beneath the foundation before the walls came down, though officials blamed shifting ground. I tried to move on, convincing myself distance would end whatever had followed me. It didn't. Because every few months, usually just after midnight, I wake without knowing why. My bedroom is silent. My apartment door remains locked. My phone shows exactly 12:17 a.m. Then, from somewhere inside my home instead of outside it, 3 perfectly spaced knocks echo through the darkness. I never investigate. I never speak. Most importantly, I never ask the question waiting on the tip of every frightened tongue. Because I finally understand the truth my grandfather spent his entire life trying to protect me from. The voice doesn't need your words. It only needs your curiosity. And if you ever hear someone softly asking, "Who's there?" after midnight, don't answer, don't investigate, and whatever happens, don't even think the question back, because some doors are opened long before anyone touches the handle. Stories about mysterious midnight knocking have appeared in folklore from several cultures, especially old European and Appalachian traditions about death knocks and spirits that imitate familiar voices. This story is fictional, but it draws inspiration from those enduring urban legends and oral traditions that have been passed down for generations.